Well, we will begin now. So, welcome everyone. Please get settled. Excited to be back here in Studio A of Kerr Hall. So, I am Sarah Pankier-Weld, professor for Comp Lit W40, Young Humans, Introduction to Childhood Studies. And we turn today to the topic of children are socialized through language, and think about a linguistics approach to childhood and to language socialization. And I am very grateful that we have the privilege today of a visit from our very special guest, Professor Lina Hou, who is a professor of linguistics. And Mala and Ajama will be interpreting. Thank you so much for visiting us today. So, Lina Hou is currently an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at UCSB. She received her PhD in linguistics from the University of Texas at Austin and was a UC presidential postdoctoral scholar in communications at the University of California, San Diego. Her research interests encompass the linguistics of signed languages, language socialization and language ideologies, and first language acquisition. And her focus is on the signed languages and signing communities of the US and Mexico, including American Sign Language, Mexican Sign Language, and making hands, an indigenous family signed language in Oaxaca. And I also wanted to mention that at UCSB on the undergraduate level, she teaches first language acquisition, language socialization, and sign languages in signing communities. So you may wish to check out her courses. And I'd also like to add that she's a member of the advisory board for childhood and youth studies here at UCSB, for which I am very grateful. So we will proceed now with Professor Hou's presentation, and then our student interviewers will join her on stage, and then we will open for audience questions afterwards. So thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Professor Hou. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the nice introduction and welcome. I appreciate being here. My name, as mentioned, is Lina. Today I'm going to talk about this topic, Introduction to Language Socialization and my research interests. The foundation of language socialization means language is fundamental. It includes a medium for socializing children, novices, to become competent and members of speech communities. It's important that we focus on those things to understand the acquisition. And I'm going to focus on the bold face items to unpack what certain things mean. The list of words, I'm not going to define what each word means, but instead tell you different researchers and scholars the meaning when they use these particular terms. If you think about the kind of assumptions and concepts that can be packed into each word, we'll start with the big one, that being language. If you asked me what language means, I would give you one answer. However, if you ask another linguistic professor, one of my colleagues here, they will probably have a slightly different definition. And the reason we have different definitions is because our research interests are different, our theoretical approaches are different. And if you were to ask linguists or professors here, they may go to another department, sociology, comparative literature, English. You pick one and ask them what language means, and you will get a very different answer. Anthropologists probably will tell you that that language means something different, is specific to humans, or maybe they'll include bugs, birds, animals, art, writing. Language can be conveyed in many different ways depending on who you ask. So there's no one specific definition of language and what it means. In the context of linguistic anthropology and anthropology in general, it can include speech and signing, writing, multimodality. Not limited to speech, it also can include different types of strategies and pathways that people use in communicating. The second term that I'd like to talk about is children. This is very interesting because many of us make assumptions of who children are and what they are. How we define who a child is and who isn't is generally done via adults. So we look at the status of children in society. What is childhood? How long does it last? What does it look like, etc. In addition, how children become adults is very important. Of course, we recognize that there are a lot of biological, cultural, linguistic variations in how different societies view children and childhood. Many of us think about children based on the age, and I put that in air quotes. In English language, we would say that an infant before the age of 1, after the age of 1, at the age of 2 is a toddler. We will define different names based on how old they are when they enter into school. We'll say kindergarten, preschool, first grade, and then we'll have more terminology, preteen, adolescent, teenager, adult, and so on, senior citizen, based on the age in our society and the stage, not limited to age, but life experience as well in what society considers the norm. This chart showing the stage isn't actually the only one. There are other charts that are different. Labeling who is a child, defining who is not, the type of abilities that they have, if they're allowed to make decisions, what they want to do, how independent they are they old enough to have relationships? Are they old enough to marry, have children, old enough to work, travel? And you can notice in different societies there are variations. Language acquisition specifically is impossible to talk about without mentioning age. Scholars who are language acquisitionists will look at the emergence of the brain and mind and how things are established in normative timelines and milestones that language can emerge specifically for speech. Anytime speech or language in general develops, and if it doesn't fit a particular timeline as what is considered normative or normal, then it will be a problem. People label it as a problem and think something is wrong because the person isn't following the timeline. Language socialization is a little different in that it takes into account who are children, who are they not. They look at one another. They have different groups, different categories across different societies. Novice is often difficult to talk about a category without thinking about expert. So novice generally means someone who is less experienced, often meaning younger, but not always. Someone who needs training, not explicit training, but training in the sense of showing another person how they're learning a particular skill, how they're using language, how they're doing activities related to role and status based on the individual's perspection or perception of what is expected of them. And so with language, young children are perceived as not full speakers. They are still growing and developing in their language. So there's a huge role in our society here where language is developed and learned through school. We have expectations about the needs to read and write well to become literate, to enter into university, to demonstrate the competence in the standard or mainstream American English, because that is a marker of intelligence or good education in our society, even though as linguists we would argue that all languages are equal. There is nothing internal or inherent about any one language that is better or worse for each person in the language that they use. So language here, obviously, we talk about mainstream American English that is spoken here. People in America think it's better. You have better job opportunities. You have professionalism, and all of that is attached to English. Children, in their view of novice, later we will see that they can become expert in some activities, whereas adults are not. Novice isn't a natural category, but it is construction. Imagine the same as an expert category. Competent members, children are looked at as competent members later in life, depending on each community, the goal for their children, what each community wants from their children. Here, obviously, many adults want children to become competent in whatever language they're learning or using when they go into school, and then a good university, get a good job, start maybe a family, etc. The community can be a family. That's probably the first community that we are part of. We are born into a family. We have culture and values, norms, beliefs, ideologies about language and about life in general, and that starts at home. Then we leave the home, maybe go to school or a bigger community. We interact with different people who have the same norms or sometimes different cultural values. And we are mainstreamed or ingrained into different parts of life that is sometimes different from our home. So when we go into school, children enter, they socialize with other children that are not their family members. Children who come from different backgrounds, different language, different cultures, learn how to interact with the professor or teacher who is not part of their family. They talk about behaviors, speaking, conduct in the classroom, etc. Speech community is a very traditional term in that anthropologists came up with it, and it can mean any community not limited to spoken language, but more broadly, any community of practice, including sign language, speech community or community of practice. They have their own ideologies and ideas about who is a member of a specific community. This class, for example, is an example of a community of practice because you, I guess, volunteered to be part of the community. You're learning more about children in literature, for example. I assume you know what your role is as an undergraduate student, what the professor's role is, certain expectations from the professor for you, and they have their own expectations for what you will do for them. And of course, then, as students, you have your own expectations, the rules of how to interact with one another and your peers. Whatever rules or cultural norms that exist or values that you adhere to here are not assigned at home, or perhaps even what you do off campus or with your friends, or people who you socialize with. Your role and status changes. We all belong to different speech or communities of practice. Language socialization and the field emerged as a response to two ongoing and established fields: language acquisition. The scholars who established language socialization, or LS as I refer to it, they said that acquisitionists ignored the socialization that people went through. And the researchers looking at language acquisition were interested in how language is learned based on vocabulary, word count, understanding, comprehension, meaning, how to produce simple, complex sentences, how sentences are produced and constructed in different communication settings, but nothing about how children learn to use the language and to adhere to the cultural norms and rules in different communities of practice. It says nothing in language acquisitionist field. So in anthropology, there's an area of general socialization, but that field isn't considered the norm, if you will, in socialization. They assume that language may not be as important. And so language socialization tries to marry the two fields by considering how children are socialized to become competent members of a community through language, and how they learn to use language to show their competence in the community. I also want to add that our role and status isn't static. It is dynamic and changes often. Of course, one time I was an undergraduate student, but it didn't last long. I graduated, then I went into grad school, and then my role and expectations as a grad student changed because I wasn't just going to classes to read and do my homework and ask questions. I was learning how to become an independent researcher, developing my own research questions, showing, I guess to the best of my ability, different levels of professionalism, working with other students, teaching undergraduate students, sometimes other graduate students. My advisor and other faculty members would work with me differently. Then I became a faculty member here, and boy, did I learn a new role because I am not a grad student anymore. Professorhood is very different. The rules are different, how I present myself. One interesting thing that comes to mind is students don't see me as a student anymore. They see me as a faculty member, and I'm still figuring out what exactly that means when I socialize myself with students, with my peers, etc. And so it works both ways. So language socialization is one way of thinking about relationships between language and culture. However, I want to emphasize that it's very different for children. So again, two central theories of language socialization: the process of acquiring and learning language, how it impacts the process of becoming a competent member. Learning a language isn't done in isolation. It is bound to family, teachers, peers, others. They look at you as competent members, meaning you are one of us. That's a way of saying it. And that it shows through the language that you're learning and how you use it. Secondly, language socialization believes that the process of becoming a competent member of society happens through the extent of language. We grow, and sometimes we don't think about the role of language, how we use it, how we use it with others, what we consider good use, or rather language users, what they consider good speakers, good writers, good signers. So your community has different views based on your status and role in your community. The language use and what is considered good language use has a particular view here at the university versus maybe other communities of practice or your home where that can be different. Of course, different from, with your peers when you're hanging out is very different than the university. But the idea of what does it mean to be a competent member happens through language use and depends on society's ideologies in the community of practice and as we see it. I'd like to talk a little bit about my research and what I call making hands in Oaxaca, in the southern part of Mexico, and I'll talk about what making hands means. This is an indigenous family sign language that emerged in a small Mesoamerican community in the southern part of Mexico. The state of Oaxaca is home to a plethora of different languages and cultures. Geographically, it makes many communities. They can preserve their language and community for a very long time, compared to all of the rest of Mexico. But you can see where it's located here in the map. And this is an area of research. When I started as a graduate student, this is municipality of San Juan Quiaje, and I'll just call it San Juan, or SJQ. The people who live there belong to an ethnic group called Chitino. It's related to the Zapotec people. And they have lived in this area for a long time. People who live there speak one variety of Chitino as their first language, and they still teach that to their children. Some know Spanish, where others only use their everyday Chitino in the village. Maybe they'll use Spanish outside because people don't know Chitino outside of the village. Again, this is in indigenous part of Mexico. In total, I would say that currently there's about 4,200 people that live there. This area, the municipality, has 2 villages. In the 1900s, there's an ongoing circle of migration, if you will, for a certain part of the United States that people would go from the community. They would look for opportunities for work. They would stay, work, collect money, and then when they were back, they would bring the money home, and they would do this on a cyclical cycle. So the communities do have a lot of contact with Spanish and English, and it's increasing every day. The community includes about 12 to 14 deaf people. I'll emphasize that by deaf people, it's just people who are part of different families. There's no deaf family, meaning that we don't see families where both parents are deaf or all the children are deaf. In the United States, we have several like this, but in this community, we do not. Also, there are no schools that focus for deaf children only. Mexico in general has no school that is designated for deaf children. The United States has some in and around the country, but Mexico does not. There is one deaf school in Mexico City, but it shut down a while ago in the 1960s. There's no deaf community, so to speak, of community of practice. We see separate communities for deaf people. Intentionally, they get together, they share language and culture, but we don't see that there. Because this is an agricultural area, a lot of farming, the community in Mexico is quite limited and has access to healthcare and limited access to other deaf people. So they don't really have access to external intervention, meaning medical treatment, quote unquote, education opportunities to learn sign language or anything of that nature. All 5 families that I focused on are called sign families, meaning that the family has a deaf person or deaf people. The 3 green, meaning hearing family with deaf children. The purple means the family has at least one deaf parent with hearing children, but I'm just going to focus on the first group, family. In this community, and true for many rural communities in Mexico, the family is the center of all society. That is everything to them.
And the community around them.
In addition to the community around them. So the making hands is an emic term for referring to signing practices of deaf and hearing people in the village. I asked a hearing mom, how do you communicate with your deaf daughter? And she said, in Chitino, she said, we make hands or sign or gesture with our hands. And so what that means is either signing or gesture to communicate. And I just want to be clear, different spoken languages have different terms. In English, we have lexical distinctions between gesture and sign, but many spoken languages do not. Both are interchangeable. The concept being separated is a little bit more complex because of my position as a sign language linguist and a scholar. I have often a clear distinction between signing to mean sign language of deaf people versus gesture that hearing people who don't know sign use from time to time when they're speaking or just gesturing to use a silent gesture like a thumbs up, but not related to sign language. So for me, they are very distinctively different. And it's important to talk about sign language not just as gesture, but as an actual fully fledged language with complex grammar. We also can overlap them at times because signing and gesture may not necessarily have an important distinction in some ways. But we can talk about ideologies of signing and gesture later on if you're interested. The point is that making hands can mean gesture or sign. Linguists have had the power to name languages around the world when they do work. It doesn't always fit how people see their language and their communication. I have tried to honor the community view in what language that they call themselves and their language. I also want to add that gesture and home signs and systems and other categories of scholarship have developed. They're more complex than just simply gesture, and it is not equivalent by any stretch of a mature sign language that stands on its own and is independent. There are situations where deaf people are not exposed to language, so they communicate using a made-up or invented home sign or gesture system. In general, there are different societies that have their cultural interpretation of what is difference. It's a very broad thing. It's not limited to just disabled people or deaf people. But I'm going to focus on deaf people as disabled here and talk about difference. So communities of practice are different. When you engage with deaf people, hearing families realize, oh, there's a deaf child. They can't learn to speak. They can't hear. They don't have full access to the spoken language in our environment. So they figure out how do they communicate, because that person's a member of the family and a member of their society. So creators of sign language are the deaf people. Hearing people have conventional gestures from the community that they use to communicate with deaf children, but the deaf children are the ones who are expanding and making this sign language. And that really impacts how language socialization and the process of it works. Because what happens is hearing family with hearing children have cultural scripts of how to raise children. Child rearing is very set. How to teach language through transmission of social cultural knowledge, traditions, values, beliefs, and all of that that is passed on from parent to child. But when you don't have language that you can share to pass on to your child, then that changes the language process and language socialization process specifically. You need to continue to pass this on, but it does cause some kind of disruption. So hearing families there were puzzled because they didn't have a shared language. The children didn't have access. How then would they raise their children to become competent members of their community? For all families in general, including sign language families, children, because they're all girls in my study, it's important that girls know what to do. They make tortillas. They know how to maintain an upkeep of the home. They know how to wash clothes. They know how to do errands and do things around the house to support the family, to feed one another, to show respect for different people based on the relationship with the people in their community. Part of my study asked these questions. How did hearing families with deaf children go through language socialization when they didn't have a shared language? I'm going to focus on one family. I call it family 3. It's a little unique from the other signing families in my study. Looking at birth order of deaf children, the family has 4 children. The first is deaf. The 2 middle are brother siblings, and the last one is a daughter who is deaf. So there's 13 years apart from deaf older to deaf younger. Based on input, socialization at home, we have these 2 sisters. So the child, there was a hearing sister who was born just after the deaf sister. And it's important to remember that the community everyone, almost everyone, lives in multi-generation, extended family. So the two girls are the only two children in the home. And the hearing daughter signs because she has a deaf mother, and the only child she plays with is the deaf aunt, I guess, if you will. But there's more functioning as a sister because of the age of the two girls. In this community, the children are friends with their siblings and cousins. They don't go to school because in the community, they don't view it as potential friends in the school. They're very apart from them. They're in the same class, but they're not friends. Particularly, it's because of how the community dictates who the children play with. The community of adults is a little different with their attitude about how to interact with children. Many adults don't see children as potential communication partners until later in life. They see the children playing. The adults will take the opportunity to work or discuss gossip with one another. They don't play with the children as we see in many Western societies. That's not considered normal there. And I'm arguing that the adults with children with one-on-one, if they play, that's a social cultural approach that they could do, but they don't. So children learn to become competent members in the community by socializing and playing with other children and observing what adults do. The signing family has developed their own language, and it's fascinating to see how language socialization occurs. Because the first deaf adult didn't treat the two girls as conversational partners until they were old enough to converse with her, they played on their own. Their interaction was limited and constrained to only responding to what people would ask. The two girls would play with one another. They would sign because the deaf girl didn't speak, and the hearing girl knew that, so they used signing. And that fostered language use between the two girls in making hands. I would argue that the family is very unique because everyone is motivated to have a commitment ethically to converse in the absence of the conventional language, and that they have visual access with adults, hearing family members. They have models and they can see how to communicate. And particularly the deaf adult. She has direct input for correcting the signing of the youngsters and polite conversations with people, and teaches them how to behave, and that this is recurring peer play between the two girls in their language and signing, same time learning how peer play and how to be friends with one another. The play with peers is also very interesting. I'm going to show what the two girls call an understanding of the kind of cultural expectations that they expect when they get older. So language acquisition and language socialization are two different kinds of language input that happens in the home environment. With sign language, it's important if children have visual access to the sign communication, and not necessarily directly, but in the environment. It's important because it allows children to see the types of behavior, cultural norms, beliefs, and events that adults are involved with. We also see that they learn what they are expected to be when they become adults based on their role and status. We do that here. I look at my professor in college and grad school to try to figure out, well, I wasn't thinking about becoming a professor at the time, but that norm and what they do, how they behave, how they talk, how they interact with students was something that I had to reflect upon and remember if I was going to become a professor. Language use is important. When we learn language, we don't just learn the language, we learn how to use it appropriately, following cultural norms, at home, at school, at work, etc. So here in the village, the deaf adult provides direct input to the deaf girl her deaf sister, in making the appropriate way to request something from an adult. Because we, at least in the English language, here in the United States, in our society, and other languages and other communities, we know there are different strategies for how to request something from people based on the relationship, the culture, what I and the other person consider polite or impolite, etc. And so it happens here in the village as well. One day when I was in the field, I had a bag of oranges with me, and the deaf girl wanted to ask me for an orange. But it just so happened her older sister was sitting and couldn't see the picture, so she saw and she thought the deaf girl didn't make the correct request because she didn't sign it right and she wasn't asking the usual way. And so the girl asked me, and then her sister interrupted. The girl looked at her and the sister signed the right way to request. So you can see it at the end. The girl looks up at the sister signs it, and then she looks at me again and copies what her sister told her to ask. So she describes how to ask, and then I give her the orange. But it was interesting to see the conversation and communication and feedback between the two deaf people. Another example of peer play here is language socialization in my view. The two girls are playing with a puppy outside. I was videotaping them, and what struck me was that they had this over and over again action. It kept coming up in play. It was clear that they were copying what they're seeing in the community. One girl looks at the puppy as a fake baby and says, "This is how you hold the baby and feed the baby." And the hearing girl says to the deaf girl, "Look, see how I'm feeding the baby?" And the two girls, very interestingly, using sign to play, but also the play tells me that the girls have already inherited or ingrained and culturated the meaning of a competent member. To have this information ingrained, to be a mother, to be responsible for caring for a child, and to having children, taking care of them at home, etc. To summarize, you may think, well, deaf people and sign language in general, how does that inform us about language socialization? One ingrained assumption about the theory is based on different research that has been published over time. The assumption that language is primarily spoken, that it is accessible for children. We know that many communities have the same language passed on, but the idea that language in and of itself is accessible to all children. And here we see the studies of deaf people and sign language. We cannot assume any longer that language socialization process will happen in a natural way without intervention of some kind, where and when deaf people cannot access the language. And that affects how children get socially cultural knowledge through language from the family. And my research shows that hearing families figure out how to communicate with their deaf children. They want to raise their children to become part of the family. They set up roles and status that is appropriate. The girls know how to cook. They know how to take care of the home. They know how to do all the things that young girls know how to do and will know what women know how to do. But what's interesting about deaf children is they are experts in creating their own language. Hearing families provide gestures to start the communication. Deaf children, if their primary language is sign, they take full advantage to expand on these notions with a new language, contributing to new signs. And at the same time, the children are socialized into hearing families, communicating better, not just learning new signs from the children that the children make up, but learning how to adapt to deaf children in the home, making things visual, making their needs met, making sure that they can see people when they're signing, that they can be understood and communicate clearly, because that isn't necessary for spoken language. Also, to add that the family that I just talked about, the deaf adult, is also key for supporting language socialization. She functions as a role model for the deaf children, and the ability to provide direct and indirect feedback, to provide modeling for how deaf adults behave or communicate with hearing adults in their environment. And that children can see and understand. Without that kind of modeling, deaf children wouldn't know what to do. They wouldn't know what would happen when they became an adult. And a common problem with deaf children is often they never meet a deaf adult, and therefore they have no idea what deaf adult means, how deaf adults function in the real world, and how they become competent members of whatever community they belong. So that's really my research in language socialization in Mexico. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor Hou.
Yes.
And at this point, we'll move to the second portion.
Ready?
Okay. Hello, my name's Kathleen. I appreciate your time today. The first question I have today was, what brought you into sign linguistics in the study of childhood? Because you've mentioned about wanting to understand your own experience.
Thank you for that question. My undergraduate major wasn't linguistics. It was actually comparative literature. But the problem of sign language of studying it and how to study it is there's nothing published. And at that time, I didn't find linguistics until after I graduated. I heard about it as a field when I was focusing on different languages, but not related to literature in the sense of written. So language that is used in different communities and around and changes over time. The problem with literature is that the language is frozen in time. It doesn't actually represent how people talk or sign or how they use language. So that's why I switched to linguistics, because it's more of what I heard and read and thought and asked questions that I wanted to answer about sign language. And I remember talking with some graduate students in comparative literature and trying to understand the research that is involved at the grad level. It wasn't what I wanted. So I looked at linguistics, because that can offer for me to learn more about sign language, about myself, about other deaf people, and about the United States as it is the leader in the world of sign language.
The second part to that question was, how did that shape your academic trajectory?
I think it gave me the opportunity to think more in depth about the type of research questions that hadn't been answered, and the opportunity to take a deep dive into what I recognize as being used in sign language, to see what has already been researched, what's been documented, but what hasn't. More of an opportunity to expand and hopefully to add and contribute to the existing scholarship on sign language and deaf people in sign communities.
That was a great response. Thank you for that. The second question I have was, from your perspective of your discipline, how do you approach childhood?
Oh, well, I always have to assume that it's not natural, in that what I know is based on my experience, what I see in my society here. But I have to be careful, because there are different opportunities. Childhood can mean so many different things. We have a category that we talk about the concept, the type of assumptions that we make about children and childhood here. And that helps me understand the type of assumptions that we make before I go into another community and research the type of attitudes or ideologies that I bring to the research as well.
For the second part of that question, is this approach different from how childhood is typically studied in linguistics or the social sciences?
Yes and no. In linguistics, there is a general agreement. Not all children approach language learning the same. First, we know that some children are raised in homes with one language, others are raised with many languages. So we have multilingual families where they learn different languages, and they're not all the same either. But it's true for the first group of children learning one language and monolingual. There's a lot of variation in language learning. At the same time, there is, I don't want to say a boundary, but there is an acknowledgement that some children seem to have no problem learning language, whereas others approach it and seem to be challenged, whether it's general intelligence different, cognitive limitations, or maybe external environmental factors that are affecting their ability to learn language. My approach, which fits with some linguists, but not all, is that we have a different view. My approach and assumption is that everything is normal for all children. Often what I consider different should not be viewed as deviant. It's just different, a part of variation that we see in the human species.
The third question I have is, in your research with deaf and hearing children and signing families, how does language socialization shape children's identities and sense of belonging?
Aha. Yes, thank you for that question. I think because the community values family as the center and primary unit of the society, I think that all children, regardless of deaf or hearing, are raised and considered as a member of the family. And so what that means is the deaf children are raised. My interpretation is they don't see themselves as deaf first. They see themselves as members of a family that they were born to. They don't consider themselves deaf in the sense of separation from hearing people, as we do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chloe. Thank you again for being here. We have a couple more questions from our side. And so often we talk about in childhood studies how it is emphasized that children are active social participants rather than passive learners. So I was just curious, and you mentioned a bit in your research, but if you could expand of how deaf children actively shape their language environments rather than passively.
I think it's fair to say in language socialization, researchers don't assume that they are passive learners. But we do assume, rather, that we observe how children show agency of their actions in different situations, how and why things happen. In my research, I found that deaf children have a strong desire to communicate and the need to express themselves and use making hands to inform other children or other adults to show what they're thinking, what they want, like any other children. And I think that in that space, there's an opportunity to be able to sign and gesture, because it's not always true for all deaf children are allowed to gesture or sign. Instead, they are forced to speak instead. Often because the family or the parents follow the doctor or medical advice that all children must learn to speak, because that's what happens. We're in a hearing world, which limits their agency and their authority to be assertive and learn on their own. Whereas in making hands in this community, they are free to express themselves through any means that they can. And it's up to the adults to figure out what they're saying, what they mean, how to understand them better. And so they are assertive in showing signs and communicating to the best of their ability and learning the language as well.
Awesome, thank you. And then for our next question, how do families, how do family sign language and mixed deaf hearing households challenge traditional ideas about what a quote unquote normal language environment for children looks like?
I think one answer could be the type of research that shows how language often appears in unequal access. What I mean by that is we can't assume that all families or all homes or even all communities of practice that there's equality or symmetry of communicating, learning, having access, using the same language. Situations where you have deaf and hearing children and adults, they have variation in the level of access and use. Not just about the ability to see or hear, but the opportunity to use, speak, or sign to different people. And I think that kind of research encourages us to take a step back and look at what's happening, the types of structure that we see, the language use, the socialization in the home. We cannot assume that is just going on as normal and the way that it goes everywhere else, because each community of practice is unique because of size, variety in family, cultural beliefs. Even with the family here, we see a lot of variation. So we have to be careful not to make assumptions. We have to look at everything before we make assumptions to lead to conclusions.
Awesome, thank you so much. And then our final one from our prepared questions that we have is, why is it important for childhood studies to more broadly take signing language seriously? And what do you think or wish more people understood about the value of your work?
I think in general it's important for childhood studies to consider the huge variation of children as a population. And I think that deaf children and sign language are part of that variation. I wish people would acknowledge that more. I think a lot focus on specific types of population, specific languages or cultures. They don't give equal attention to others. I think it's really important to consider childhood studies. If you think about what variation and diversity we see out there, and include as much as possible
Of the linguistic and cultural.
of the linguistic and cultural varieties that we have and diversity, including deaf as part of the biological diverse human species instead of just disabled.
Amazing, thank you so much. Now we'd like to open it up to the class if anyone has any additional questions they'd like to ask Professor.
Questions, you can come up to the front of the room and grab your microphone.
I also like your last question too. If there aren't questions in the audience right now, maybe you'd like to ask your last question.
Yes, of course. So finally, this is more of just a passionate, fun question, but what do you enjoy most about working with children and signing communities?
That's a tough one. Do I have to pick one answer?
And any answer you'd like to give?
I think I'm constantly surprised when children see the world that I haven't considered in my view. That's very exciting. When they tell me how they see the world, how they interact, I think, oh, I didn't even think about that. And that's pretty amazing. It's been a long time since I've been a child myself. And so I also enjoyed working with deaf children and signed communities more in general, because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to connect with them on a more personal level because we have some, not all, but some things in common. And sometimes when I'm not in my researcher hat, just as a person, I can just talk with them, talk about experiences or tell stories or talk about life views and exchange information. And at a minimum, that requires us to be able to communicate and work in the community, not as a member of, but as a guest.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Unless anyone has any other questions, we'd just like to thank Professor for coming in today and sharing your passion and just about your research with us. It was amazing to hear about.
Thank you. Your questions were great.
Amazing.
Thank you so much. And thank you again, Professor Hou. That was amazing. And thank you to the interpreters as well. Thank you to the students and our audience. And thank you for the fantastic readings and really opening everyone's eyes to the complexities of language socialization and how much that is that can be invisible, that should be made visible. Yeah, it's been a very enriching visit, both the reading and your presentation and your answers to the questions. So we thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was my pleasure visiting your class. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for the questions. They were really great and made me think.
Thank you.
My office is in South Hall, 3rd floor, if anyone wants to come and visit.